this Technique Tuesday video, I'll show you how to use mattress stitch to seam reverse stockinette fabric. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. Now, there are a number of ways to seam knitted fabric. One of the most common methods is mattress stitch, which can be used to join vertical edges, horizontal edges, as well as a vertical edge to a horizontal edge. When done correctly, the seam is virtually invisible from the right side of the fabric, with the stitch pattern smoothly crossing the seam line with no interruption. So this is a sweater where the seam was worked in stockinette stitch, and the seam is very difficult to see unless you pull the fabric apart, and then you can tell that right there's a little bit more of a gap than there is otherwise. So mattress stitch does the job it's intended to do here, which is to hide the seam. When you have a reverse stockinette seam, the stitch pattern flows continuously across the seam line. You can't really see the seam. In this case, as I stretch, the seam becomes less visible, and as it relaxes, the ditch appears, where with stockinette, the seam is not visible when relaxed and becomes more visible when it's stretched. I'm going to show how to join an edge and then get started in a reverse stockinette seam, and then I'm going to show you a seam that I have in an actual garment that's in process at the moment. When we join the seam and do the first few inches of the seam, we're going to use the yarn tail. We have to weave this in anyway, and so it's nice to be able to join the work and get the seam started in this yarn tail. The tail does not have to be long enough to do the entire seam. It just needs to be long enough to get going. So in this case, I've got the yarn tail on the left edge, and I'm going to do what's called a figure 8 join. And what you do with the figure 8 join is in the corner of the piece that does not have the yarn tail, you come up through the edge. So here I've got 2 loops of the edge stitch, and I'm between that selvage stitch and the second stitch in right above the edge of the cast on. I bring the needle up from bottom to top and I pull up, not tightly yet. Then I'm going to come behind, from above and behind the strand that's there now. I'm going to come behind it here. And then I'm going to bring the needle up from bottom up, again between the first and second stitch and right above the edge. So you can see I'm right above the edge of the cast on, and I'm bringing this up. So it's called a figure 8 because it forms an 8 when you make that join. I'm going to pull it, I'm not going to pull it too tight yet. I'm going to let the seam be fairly loose when I get started. Once you've done the figure 8 join, it's time to seam. Look at the fabric. If you pull apart the fabric, you can see how you get these sets of purl bumps. You'll have upper, lower, upper, lower, and then you'll see a gutter, and then you'll have another set of upper, lower. Each one of these rows of offset pairs represents one row of knitting. So you want to seam one row to the other row. And on one side of the fabric, you're going to capture an upper bump, and then on the other side of the fabric, or the other edge of the seam, you're going to catch the lower bump of the corresponding row. The lower bump, some people call these the smiles and the upper ones the frowns. The lower bump is a little bit further from the edge. It's actually the running thread between the selvage stitch and the second stitch in. So it's pretty easy to find. So you look for that lower bump on the left edge and you capture it and you pull the yarn through, but don't pull it through tightly yet. Now on this side of the seam, we want to get the last upper bump, and that can be trickier to find. So what I do is I look for the lower bump, and then I know that the upper bump is to its left. And so if you can't see it right away, sometimes you have to dig around in the edge. The nature, and it's right here, the nature of flat knitting is the first stitch that you work on any row is the last stitch you work the previous row. So the edges tend to behave a little differently than the rest of the fabric. So now I'm coming back over here. I can see where I came out before. So I want to capture that low bump that's in the row right above that. Again, I'm not pulling tightly yet. So then I come over to this side of the fabric. I can see here's the lowest bump, the low bump that's closest to the edge. So I need to find that upper bump. It's kind of hiding right here, but I've caught it now. So that upper bump is the head of the stitch, the selvage stitch. That's why it can be hard to find. So I'm coming back over here. I can see where I came out last time. So I want to catch that lower bump in the row right above it. So you go back and forth. Here's the lower bump. I want the upper bump. Here's the lower bump. Come over here. I can see the lower bump. Now I'm going to have to, there it is. It's right there. Get the upper bump. So you can use the tail for quite a while usually. If you have a fair amount of tail, you can use it for quite a while. And so I have all of these loose strands. Nothing's tight yet. I never want it to be super tight. I just want to pull it enough to close the edges because I still want that seam to be flexible. I don't want it to be rigid. Some people will seam all the way up. They'll pull on the seaming yarn from where it's coming out of the fabric and to tighten up the entire thing. That creates a very rigid straight line of seaming yarn and a very rigid seam, which is, you want the seam to stretch just like the rest of the fabric. You come a couple of strands above this edge and you give it a pull to see which side of this strand is pulling the strands below it. And in this case, it's the one on the right. So I'm just going to pull it enough to close things up. And then I'm going to come up here. I'm going to pull on one of these and see which one is pulling the strands below it. And I'm just pulling the slack out of it. I do this all the way up. I really don't want to tighten the last set of bumps, but so then you can see that it's a pretty good seam. And I think this result is better than doing the upper bump on the left and the lower one on the right. I haven't figured out why, it just does. So this is a sweater I told a story about on this past Friday's Casual Friday video. I knit it in 1990 and I did not really know how to seam properly at the time. I used whip stitch to do the seaming. And I did it on the wrong side of the fabric. So I was doing the whip stitch on the knit side of the fabric, and it actually doesn't look that terrible. It doesn't look great, but it doesn't look terrible. When you look at it on the right side of the fabric, which is the purl side, then you see this kind of really bad looking ridge. So what I've been doing is taking these old seams out and redoing them. So I've done the other side seam, and this hasn't been washed since then. So the kind of the dip that you get in the seam is a little more exaggerated than it will be once it's been washed and blocked. Here's that upper bump. And I'm always looking for where I came out from. I came out from here, so I'm looking for this bump right above it. I came out from here, and I'm looking for the bump above it. This is one that's hiding. So now I have a fair amount of stitches to tighten up. So there you go. It's looking pretty good. And you can see the little white blips of the seaming yarn right there. On the inside of the fabric, what you end up with is half a stitch. You have a seam where instead of right here, I had seamed the ribbing, which was in knit stitches. So I have a full stitch on each side, and then I switched to the reverse stockinette seaming of the background. So I have a full stitch on one side and a half a stitch on the other that creates the ridge on the inside of the fabric. Leave a 4 to 6 inch tail when casting on. You're going to use the tail to do the figure 8 join and to work the first several inches of the seam. If your tail is too short, you won't be able to use it to get your seam started. If you need to do increases or decreases at the edges of your fabric, make sure to do them a stitch or two away from the edge. That will make the process of seaming much easier. Work the same number of rows for each piece so that you can match your seams row for row. Wash and block your pieces before seaming. Stockinette fabric has a strong desire to curl. If you wash the fabric first, it will relax, and if you pin the edges while they dry, you won't have to fight that curl while you seam. In most cases, you'll use your project yarn to do the seaming, but sometimes you can't, either because the yarn is very bulky or isn't strong enough, or the texture makes it difficult to seam with, or maybe you just don't have enough of it. If you need to use a different yarn to seam with, make sure that the seaming yarn and the project yarn are similar in terms of fiber content and washing instructions. When seaming garments, start at the hem or cuff and work toward the underarm. That way, if your seam is off by a row or two, it won't be noticeable. Use locking stitch markers to match up rows before you seam. If you're off by a row or two on one side as you approach the marker, catch 2 rows of purl bumps on the longer side rather than just one. I'll be finishing up the seaming on that old Aran sweater in the next day or two, and once that's done, I'll be dyeing it in a darker color. If you want to hear more about this sweater's past, you can watch last week's Casual Friday video up here. If you want to watch me dye the sweater and see how it all turns out, you can watch this week's Casual Friday video down here once it's been uploaded. If you have any questions or comments about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks, and there's a link to that down in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you Friday.